Hey guys, welcome back. So today I want to talk about the American-made forgotten AUG, or AUG as I like to call it. People will say don't call it an AUG because the Austrians actually call it the AUG, and they say we don't live in the country of USA, we live in the USA. But to them I say, do you say RADAR or do you say radar? So anyway, I will call it an AUG quite often. Sometimes I'll call it an AUG. This is an original AUG. This is a pre-ban import. The gun was designed in 1977, entered military service in 1977 in Austria, then spread out from there. So it's still a current military rifle for a number of different countries. And it was imported in the 80s to the United States. And I was exposed to these rifles as a kid and fell in love with them, as many folks have, especially if you watch the Christmas movie Die Hard. So in today's video, we're going to talk about a US-made version of this because during the ban era, George Bush, 41, president, banned these by name in 89. And that kind of dried the market up, and Americans were really hungry for AUGs again because this has always been a popular gun. If they show up on the walls of a gun store today, they don't typically hang around very long, even because they're even expensive, and yet people will still buy them today. So it's always been a very popular rifle. So let's talk about this forgotten American-made AUG that some of you may not even know existed. Over the years, you guys have seen me use a lot of primary arms optics, everything from red dot sights to magnified optics. And why do I do that? Well, over the years, they've offered very good products for a very fair price. They have fast shipping, outstanding customer support, and that's why you've seen me using those products for so many years. If you guys would like to pick up a magnified optic like you see on this Daniel Defense Mark 12, you can pick up an optic like this one. Just put it in your cart over at pa.com or primaryarms.com. And if you use the code MAC at checkout, MAC at checkout, you'll get a free scope mount with your optic, and that goes for any Primary Arms branded optic. If you pick up an optic that has an integrated mount, use that code MAC at checkout, and you'll get a free Kill Flash ARD for that optic. So please swing by and check out primaryarms.com. Steyr of Austria tried to meet those import restrictions by putting a thumbhole stock on it. They made the stocks in gray. They had a heavy bull barrel and no muzzle device on the end, and those were allowed to come into the country as featureless firearms, and they weren't considered part of the ban because they were different enough. And that's what we had to contend with from '89, and then of course we had the Clinton assault weapons ban. So it was very difficult to get a pre-ban AUG, and the prices on them just kept creeping up, and people paying more and more for them. So Microtech, the knife company, decided they wanted to get into the gun game, and they were going to clone this particular rifle. So now, keep in mind, guys, I don't want to get too wordy here, but cloning a gun is not a simple thing to do. Guns, even though they're simpler machines, are extremely difficult to reverse engineer from a single copy, or even if you have 5 copies. What you need is the technical data package, or what I'll refer to as the TDP. Without that TDP, you don't know what the tolerance stackings are. With any manufactured item, there are variances within the size and shape of things that are allowed, and that's all detailed in the TDP. So when those tolerances start to stack up, you will know if you're getting into an area where the gun's going to become problematic through those tolerances stacking up. And so without that information, you're basically working with the equivalent of a drawing on a piece of paper that somebody scribbled out on a napkin, and you're going to try to reverse engineer it, even though you have a physical rifle. You can take all the measurements you want, but because of those variances in manufactured items, it's just a very, very hard thing to do. In essence, you're starting from the ground up. You just have an idea of what you're trying to get to. And that's where Microtech stepped in. They thought they could clone the rifle, and they did an okay job, but we'll get more into that here in a minute. The rifle in this case is a Generation 1 gun. There were 4 generations and then an E4 version. Again, we'll get into that later in the video. But this is a Generation 1 limited edition kit, and it's been sitting around for a while. You can see the dust and stuff on it. But it has MSAR on it, and that stands for Microtech Small Arms Research. And this is a Pelican case. And inside, now you didn't have to buy them with the full kit like this. This is something they did a couple of times with limited kits. But in the original limited kit run, you would get the rifle, a sling, a scabbard, a Microtech fixed blade knife that has a serial number matching that of the gun, and then you would get 4 different magazines to go with it. So I think this is a 42 rounder, 30, 20, and a 10 rounder, I believe. And then here's another sling. I think this is actually part of something. I don't even remember what that goes to. This is the actual sling. So anyway, this would be the kit. Now, Microtech wasn't content with just cloning the original gun. They wanted to modernize the gun a bit, which I think was a good idea. So let's talk about next this rifle, some of the changes that Microtech made to it, and then go through the generational changes of the gun before it ultimately went out of production and Steyr USA came online and just basically, took Microtech's thunder and kind of ruined the whole prospect of these guns remaining in production. So we'll try to touch on all the salient points here and compare the MSR to the original Steyr AUG. Now, this thing is not a one-for-one clone. Most of the parts in old guns, all the way up to the current generation of Steyr AUG that's now made in the United States, the parts are not interchangeable. And that goes back to, again, them not having the TDP, and they're just kind of guessing at the dimensions and what they should be. And so many of those parts, again, will not work with this gun. Now, you'll notice on top here, this looks like the original style optic. It has, the swoopy lines, has the adjustment knobs on it. But this optic, from what I gather, would go through evolutionary changes. This is a Gen 1 gun, and it has what I believe is Chinese glass in it, and they're kind of known for problems. Let's just get this out of the way. These guns are just known for problems, okay? They had all sorts of issues with them. So I'll try to touch upon all the points I know of where these guns had failures, which caused generational changes throughout the production run of the guns. Now you'll notice that this optic is bolted to the receiver, and so it would be available both with a 1.5 magnified optic on it, or you could get it with a pick rail. And out front, we have a QD mount, which is nice because we wouldn't see that till much later on the US-made Steyr AUGs. And we still maintain the quick change barrel system, exact same gas system in appearance anyway. Have a fluted barrel, and they call it a tulip muzzle device. It's a flash hider that's rather unique looking and has these, all this balling around it and stuff. It's just kind of an interesting looking profile on the barrel. You'll also notice on the vertical grip that it has finger grooves on it and texturing, but it still works in much the same way as the original gun. You can pull it down, fold it forward, but it doesn't have the same quality feel to it. But and the finger grooves are in the wrong spot because I very rarely grab the gun like this. You'll mostly grab it like this, and that's not anywhere near where your fingers are, so it feels a little bit awkward in the hand. On the left-hand side of the gun, we have a polymer charging handle. These were notorious for breaking off. Companies like Ratworks and a few other companies out there would offer charging handles that were available to replace broken ones or to replace them before you actually broke them. You'll also notice as we come back, the receiver maintains much the same profile. Over here on the right-hand side, you'll notice there's some helicoils inside here where you could put fairly substantial pick rails over here. This is something I wish the current generation of Steyr AUGs made by Steyr USA would incorporate, because you could put rails over here and actually get some use out of them. The current generation guns just have a little tiny 1913 pick rail about here on the receiver. So that would be a welcome change. But yeah, you could put pick rails over there. The optic, just like the original, has backup iron sights, which are nowhere near zeroed, and maintains a cross-block safety. But what's interesting is they've rounded the edges, and so it doesn't have the sharp edges that the even current Steyr AUGs still have. They rounded those off, and that feels pretty nice. They've changed the texturing of the polymers, and the grip is more squared off. I don't know if you can see that, but the grip is more squared off and less rounded, and it has some texturing on it here, whereas the texturing on the original Steyr AUG is all the same, and the grip's more rounded. You can notice on the bottom here, we have some holes. Now, later models of the gun would incorporate mounts down here. The gun takes apart just like the original. You just have this cross pin, you push it across, the gun breaks down. It has a port cover, which would evolve over the years. Again, we'll get into that here in a minute. But it has this that we've never seen on an actual Austrian-made gun or even the Steyr USA guns, and that's a forward assist. And I always thought this was interesting because the charging handle on the original guns was a forward assist. If you'd pull it back, a bolt wasn't all the way in battery, you could pull the charging handle back, and as you pushed forward on it, it would grab the front of that rod that runs through the receiver, and you could force it home. So it already had an original forward assist built into the original design, but for some reason, they decided to put it on the side of the receiver here. You'll also notice that the gun has a last round hold open and a manual bolt hold open and bolt release on the left-hand side. You can tell this is an early generation 1 gun because there's no fencing around this device. Now, modern Steyr AUGs will have very similar functionality, but the Microtech kind of did that before Steyr did, I believe, if I'm correct. Disassembly of the gun is much the same. We'll get into that here in a moment, but you just basically take out this rear pin, take off the butt plate, the internals come out, push this cross pin across, and the whole thing will slide forward. These optics were known to failure. The charging handles were known to failure. The bolts were known to have failures of the bolt lugs, and extractors on these things break like crazy. And so Ratworks made an entire bolt, which I don't have out here. I have one, I forgot to bring it out. But they made an entire bolt that was not going to break, that used standard AR-15 extractors. So if you did break an extractor, you weren't out of luck. If I break the one in this gun, I'm kind of out of luck because spare parts are non-existent for this. Matter of fact, if I just wanted to try to buy a pick rail in case this optic goes bad, which again it's known to do, I can't even find the pick rails for these anymore. They're just very, very rare. Now this gun has a serial number of 168, and again with that limited edition case. So in 2007, Microtech started talking about the announcement of this product at SHOT Show, and it would go into production fairly soon after. Now, I've seen some posts from people on various forums talking about receiving their guns in 2008, but I'm pretty sure that that they were already starting to work on serial production in 2007. The guns would go out of production in 2015. There was a hiatus in there between 2007 and 2015 where these were not produced. Microtech stopped the production of them, and I'm not sure why. Either it was poor sales, or perhaps it was just a business decision. They wanted to refocus on making knives, whatever. But this was a separate business division of Microtech. So in 2015, production stopped completely. Now, there is a story to be told. This is a current production AUG that's made here in the United States. And that story about the USA AUGs is pretty interesting. Let me quickly touch upon that. So a company called Saber Defense made a deal with Steyr of Austria, and they started making receivers and eventually entire guns for the US market. And they were called Saber Defense guns. I actually have one of them. And Saber Defense would start manufacturing those receivers, which got them around the 922R nonsense left over from many of all the bands. And so they started to be able to make the receivers here, and then eventually Steyr USA would be formed from the original Saber Defense. They would take over their assets. I think Saber got into some sort of legal trouble. But anyway, there were other companies that also made receivers for Steyr to manufacture the guns in the United States, and that would include Voltor and FN, believe it or not. So now Steyr USA is well established, and they're producing modern guns with modern features. You can see here where the bolt hold open is present on the original gun that uses proprietary magazines. If you get the NATO stock, you lose this functionality. But you can see how the guns have kind of evolved over the years. The rails have evolved. Everything has changed. They've changed bolt carrier designs, and one thing that's never changed really is the barrel. The barrel from a 1977 gun will plug in and work just fine in a gun that was made yesterday, so that's pretty interesting. But this is an example of a current production Steyr AUG made by Steyr USA, formerly Saber Defense. So this gun gets its start about 2 years before Saber Defense starts making receivers here in the United States. They started around 2009. Now, this being a Gen 1 gun, that means it's going to have no fencing on the stock, and I'm not going to be able to touch upon all the points. These are just some of the most salient points. It's not going to have any of the fencing here. It has a forward assist. It has flutes on the carrier. So we're going to go ahead and make sure that the weapon is empty. Push in, and then push across, take the pin out, and then the butt plate just pulls out, just like a regular Steyr. And then your trigger group will pop right out. You'll notice how tight fit that was. A regular AUG, that'll just pull right out, but it looks pretty much just like a Steyr AUG trigger group. Heavy use of polymers, right? Polymer hammer, polymer sear, all sorts of that stuff, just like the original Steyr. Taking the receiver off, the stock is just like the original. Pull this pin across, and it will just slide forward. Very tight fitting. And this is where we get into some differences. Now, if you take a look at this gun, the Generation 1 guns have flutes on the bolt carrier. You'll see the fluting on both sides. You'll also notice these ribs, and this is for the forward assist to work. Much like the serrations on an AR-15 bolt, that's what these are, serrations that you won't find on a Steyr USA or Austrian-made gun. This is to work with the forward assist that's on the left-hand side of the receiver. The barrel on these would maintain a 13x1 metric thread, which would be similar to a European standard. It's also hard to pick dates, and these generational changes they played fast and loose with. When they were making changes, they would mix match parts. So if they came out with a Gen 2 change, but they still had a bunch of Gen 1 parts, they would just slap them in there. So there's no real clear delineation between the generations, because like I saw one poster say on a discussion forum, they were using floor sweepings as they went through their generational changes, just, you know, ad hoc putting the guns together, which I think led to the bad reputation that this gun developed for being unreliable, unpredictable, and breaking parts. So I don't know the years which these generational changes actually took place. It's kind of fuzzy. So on the Generation 2 guns, they would do away with the bolt flutes. That would probably be a cost-cutting measure. I can't imagine that lended in any way to reliability issues. They would put swivel pockets. So you'll notice here on the cross pin has a QD mount on it. If you look on the front of the receiver, it has a QD mount on it. They would also put mounts on the bottom of the stock in the Generation 2 gun. It would still maintain the forward assist in Generation 2, and it still maintained the 13x1 left-hand threads, or it might not be left-hand, I think it's just 13x1 threads. Then we move into the Generation 3. In the Generation 3, they got rid of the external forward assist. I should also note that I think it was Generation 2 when they started to put the fencing around the bolt release. So the Generation 1 guns would be the only ones without the fencing. So by Gen 3, they get rid of the forward assist. And this is another interesting thing about the gun. While traditional real Steyr AUG mags might fit into some guns, like this gun it won't fit into, the Microtech mags were more narrow. You can just pick the two different magazines up and feel them. They reverse engineered the mags, but they got the dimensions wrong. So the Generation 1 and Generation 2 guns would only use MSAR mags. They could not fit or accommodate regular Steyr AUG mags because they just simply won't fit into the magazine well. Now by Generation 3, they would change that so it would accept and use standard Steyr AUG proprietary magazines. But it still did not have what we would later come to know as a NATO stock that would use AR-15 magazines. Then we get into the Generation 4 guns, and they would change the port cover here, so it's just a twist-off port cover. Again, to convert it from right to left-handed use, you just swap out the bolt. So there were right-handed bolt and left-handed bolt guns out there. If you read the literature from the Generation 1 gun, I think it's interesting they mention a 6.8 SPC chambering, but I've never seen one for sale. I don't know if they ever made that gun, but that'd be really cool to have one of these in 6.8 SPC. Generation 4 guns would switch over to a 1/2x28 thread on the barrel. And let's see, they upgraded the optics knobs, okay? And the optics knobs on these early guns were known for losing their clicks, and then when you shot the gun, the reticle would just go all over the place. And there was nothing you could really do about it except rip it off there, put the pick rail conversion on it, and put a different optic on it, or perhaps buy another one of the Chinese optics. So that's also interesting. If you'll notice on this, you may think that the optic is setting pretty darn low. It is. It's setting almost a 1/2 inch lower than the original Steyr AUG's optic. I can get my face down, but I really have to press it down to get a view through the lens on the ocular side of the optic. Like Jason, he really has to press his face down there, depending on, like I have a long, narrow face, so I can press my face into it and see the optic. Well, that was a problem. So later, I think it was in the Generation 4 guns, they moved that optic up to the proper height so it wasn't setting so low where you're having to mash your face into the stock to use the 1.5 scope. And then it was around serial number 6800 that they started using a different stock that would accommodate the last generation of the gun, so it would fit the E4 version. So we have Gen 1, Gen 2, Gen 3, Gen 4, and then the E4 would be the last generation of the gun before it went out of production. The last generation of the gun would use AR-15 magazines. It, of course, no longer had the forward assist on the side of the receiver. And then it was the E4 version that they increased the height of the optic that was available for it to get it up to where it was the same height, roughly the same height as the original Steyr AUG, because for years people complained that it was too low, but it took them until the final generation of the gun to actually put the optic at the right height. And then on the rails that were available for these, so if you went without the 1.5 power optic, you went with the rails. The early rails were too tall. People were complaining about the height of them. By the E4, they had lowered those rails a little bit. So they raised the optic on the optic guns, and on the rails, they lowered the rails to make them more usable for the end user. And then the guns in 2015 went out of production. Now, along that time, again, the guns are known for breaking bolt lugs, breaking charging handles, breaking extractors, breaking all sorts of stuff. And a whole cottage industry sprung up to help owners fix the guns and keep them up and running. And also Microtech probably had a horrendous backlog of people sending their guns in for warranty service, because you would buy a brand new gun and it just simply wouldn't cycle out of the box. The gun just didn't work. And if you did get one that worked, you could go 1,000, maybe 2,000 rounds, and then you start breaking parts. You can find the Microtech rifles online for sale in various places, and they'll typically bring anywhere from $1,500 to $2,000 in price. Now keep in mind, you can buy an actual Steyr USA made gun that doesn't have the problems that these are notorious for about $1,799, less than $2,000. There's not much of a collector's market for these. I don't know if it's just because a lot of people don't know they exist, or it's because everybody knows how many problems these guns were known to have. So if you're looking at picking one of these up as a collector's item, I don't think they're going to have a much collector's value down the road, simply because of all those problems. All right, guys, if you enjoyed today's content, please consider becoming part of our Patreon family. There's a link in the video description below. If you join our Patreon family, you'll get early access to videos like this one. Plus, you'll get direct access to me. I answer all private communications. Also, right here on YouTube, you got that little join button underneath the video player you're watching right now. Mash that join button and help support us in the age of demonetization. And last but not least, guys, please swing by and check out coppercustom.com. Thank you for 14 years of support, and we'll talk to you guys soon.